There are bad things that happen everywhere. But Eastern Europe, I think, is specific in having, for a lot of its history, no sense of stability or security. None of that kind of like hard ground that you're like, France isn't going to disappear. Russia's not going to disappear. But a lot of these, Poland disappeared. Hungary disappeared. Slovenia took a very hard way of being born. Yugoslavia disappeared. That the whole foundation of life, and before that, Austro-Hungary disappeared. That your whole world can vanish within your lifetime, multiple times. That you have to find yourself on this kind of sweeping sea and find a place.
Jakub Mikanowski is a freelance journalist and author whose writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The Guardian, The Atlantic, The New York Times, and many other publications. However, I'm going to be talking to Jakub today because last year he published a phenomenal book called Goodbye Eastern Europe, an intimate history of a divided land, which I really swallowed like a hungry hippo. Jakub, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Zaza.
I gotta tell you, you and your book are really godsend to this podcast. I mean, I'm from Eastern Europe, from Slovenia to be more exact, and so for the past 30 episodes, I talked to some really incredible people having these amazing, illuminating conversations about the secrets of space and the Ottoman Empire and the hard problem of consciousness and the Mongol invasions, making up for when I didn't pay any attention in school. But all along, I was secretly hoping that I would eventually be able to also talk about, my own corner of the world. But since the podcast is in English and since Eastern Europe, as we know, usually garners little interest unless some new Chernobyl or a new war erupts there, I thought fat chance, But here you are with this delicious book. And I also got to tell you why I enjoyed it so much. It was because reading it sometimes felt almost like reading an epic fantasy novel, like an Eastern European Lord of the Rings or something. There's just so many colorful characters and places and stories in your book. Only they're real. We just haven't heard of them. On the other hand, even we who come from Eastern Europe often believe in this myth that Eastern Europe is just a whole lot of gray, and that includes our histories as well. Your book shows that it's anything but. So maybe let's start here with Eastern Europe as the undesirable label, as something you usually want to run away from. And let me read a couple of sentences from the beginning of the book real quick. I think it's in the prologue. Here we go. A friend of mine, a professor of Polish and German history, once had a student ask, in all seriousness, whether it was true that Eastern Europe was a gray place, where no one ever laughed. With dour connotations like these, it is no wonder that people want to escape being associated with Eastern Europe. In the past 30 years, country after country has shed the label. Even before the fall of the Berlin Wall, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland all declared themselves part of Central Europe. Well, first of all, absolute traitors. And second of all, when and why do you think we acquired this image of being the trashy Europeans coming from a very gray place?
That's an interesting question of when. And that anecdote, actually just that professor who had that student, I just saw him a few months ago, reminded him of this. Because actually that he told that story and kind of got me working on the book a little bit. I was like, we need to find some way to lift that cloud of gloom, because there's a little bit of truth to it, but there's a lot more going on the surface.
Right.
Historically, there are a couple answers to that, competing ones. One is that it's all post World War II. That has to do with the Soviet Union and socialism and the Iron Curtain that solidified this big gap, this big break between capitalist West, socialist, increasingly backwards, increasingly kind of slow-moving East. There's a historian named Larry Wolff, though, at NYU, who makes the argument that it's actually a lot older, that prejudice of the West against the East goes back to the 18th century and the Enlightenment, and that when you started having France, especially France, but also Scotland, also Germany, being kind of heartlands of philosophy and what they thought was the most modern, progressive European ideals of freedom, and then the beginning Industrial Revolution, that they started describing themselves as advanced and looking east and looking at bad roads in Poland and backwards agriculture in Hungary and Slavonia and old kinds of old-fashioned beliefs and vampires down in Croatia and what used to be the military boundary, that they started defining that specifically Eastern idea. So you could say it's pretty recent, it's a 20th century thing, or it's very old. You could even find traces of before that goes all the way back to the pagans, that there used to be, Western Europe is really an idea that comes out of Christendom and Christianity.
You're right.
And that Western Europe was the first to be Christian, the first to be increasingly homogenous and Christian. And Eastern Europe was this either Orthodox, which is a different kind of Christianity, but it stayed pagan, lots of it, much longer, kind of with Scandinavia. So you could say 50 years ago, 70 years ago, 200 years ago, or even 1,000 years ago.
Do you think the pendulum will swing the other way? For example, these days, Western Europe, or the West in general, has to deal with its colonial legacy a lot, which is something that most countries in Eastern Europe, especially the smaller ones, don't have to deal with. And also, it's a little bit ironic because with our generation, it's quite often the opposite. We look at our parents' photos when they were younger and we see the relative prosperity that they enjoyed after the Second World War in Yugoslavia, the holidays in Croatia, the apartments they bought for peanuts, the jobs waiting for them after graduation, the friendships with the people from the other republics. There's even a name for it back home. We call it Jugonostalgia. We miss it even though we haven't really lived in it.
That's interesting. I think it really varies. And I've heard absolutely that Jugonostalgia. I was in North Macedonia, on Lake Ohrid in a cab, a gypsy cab, like a unofficial cab. I needed to get to Albania.
Right.
With a bunch, and you pile in, and we had some people from Serbia, some people from Macedonia, some people from Croatia, everyone staying around the lake. And I can understand Serbian enough to, actually Macedonian I can't understand at all, but Serbian I can kind of follow from Russian. And it was absolutely that conversation of like, under Tito, it was great. We all came here for vacation, and everyone was friends, and everyone played by the lake. Because these are people who had been coming to Lake Ohrid, since for 40 years, pensioners. And that feeling of it, back in the day, it was better. That's much, but that's much stronger in former Yugoslavia. In Poland, you almost never hear that.
Right.
Poland has very little, because also the economy was so bad in the 80s.
Yeah.
Kind of wiped out most of that, those feelings. So you have, it ranges where people feel the most affection towards the past. It's been interesting to see in I don't really write about East Germany very much. I kind of avoid it. But this year there's been a real kind of debate about the East German past, and it does kind of divide generationally. People who were very young when the wall came down do look back. And there's this book by Katia Hoyer who looks back really fondly at the really solid social services, the really like cheap apartments, great childcare, solid vacation time, and say, this seems great. And then they're like a different generation, older, is like, well, you don't see the Stasi, you don't see the border patrol, you don't see how the surveillance, and it really divides, in terms of the memory is disputed in a lot of places. Romania, you kind of get both. So it's interesting. So the reevaluation is going on. And I admit I have some of that, ambivalence, because I do look, there's a part of that past, especially the part where you had solid housing and solid employment, that seems very attractive. So I think people are reevaluating it, but it depends who, and it really will break down based on country and generation.
Maybe it's also like you said, a generational thing, because the generation of my parents, they were the ones looking towards the West,
Yep.
and the ones who were kind of driving this movement for the establishment of independent countries and so forth. But interesting you mentioned Germany, because I lived in Berlin for many years, and I remember talking to a gentleman who was about 50 years old, and he actually escaped from East Berlin to West Berlin when he was 16 years old, along with his two brothers. But these days, he said, he also feels nostalgic for Eastern Germany. He said there was more sense of solidarity and sort of brotherhood, and neighbor was helping neighbor, sort of like maybe looking at the past with rose-tinted glasses, but it's hard to just ascribe it to that, I don't know. It's an interesting debate.
It's interesting, 'cause I think that a lot of the post-89 national narratives are very much about rejecting that past, very much in Hungary, very much in Poland, very much in, I think, the former Baltics, the post-45 past. You really reject and push away. There's also an achievement, like an ambiguous achievement. I found, looking at kind of socialist realist art from that era, I went to Albania.
Nice.
They have a museum of just fantastic, actually, the museum's closed because of an earthquake, but when you could go, the Albanian National Museum, just full of socialist realist, like, Hoja era art. Every painting is, burly men building power lines or working in a steel forge, or women with Kalashnikovs, teaching literacy or doing exercises. Like this very Hojaite Maoist art, and it looked great. There's something that was like, it used to be, I think, like 30 years ago, you'd be like, well, this is just the emptiest, most rote propaganda. And now it's so different from aesthetics of the present. Divorced from message, divorced from, supporting message. It was like really neat.
Yeah,
and people
badass.
were just really enjoying it. It looked so cool.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. You go to like places that have that massive socialist realist architecture. I went to she tortured my wife by going to places. We'd go on vacation and be like, we're going to go to wine country. We're going to do a little bit of spa, but in between I have to go visit some gulags. And I have to visit some old steel mills for my book. And we're like, so we'd go to like a Stalinist era steel mill, city that used to be called Stalin Varosh, now Dunaj Varosh, but was Stalin's towns, and where they built from nothing, from mud, they built these giant steel works to create the new man and create the new sense of being. And I think for a generation, it was like, well, this is horrible. And now you see and they built the factory, and the factory is also this kind of almost temple. It has porticos, it has columns, and it has huge statues and murals of workers and peasants and people across time building and baking and forging. And it's visually, I think, really phenomenal, really striking. But the movement in Poland, for instance, has been very much to destroy, condemn, tear down. And I'm really against that. I think it all belongs. Not that the period was good or positive or that people's lives were great, but that story is worth preserving. And the visual impact, I actually love that in Albania, that they actually very much reject the political legacy of that dictatorship. But they have made space for the cultural product of it, and that you can still kind of see and appreciate and have that layered history of, various epics, each with their own style. But it's very dynamic what's happening, in the Baltics and Hungary. The move is very much to exclude and destroy. In Czechia and Slovakia will kind of go back and forth on what they do. But that past is Hungary, probably it's the most under contention, Romania too. But it keeps changing how people regard it. And I think it'll continue to keep changing. My hope is that eventually it can become it's now really part of politics. It's a football that you can pass around, and that it becomes history, and that you can have some distance towards and both preserve, appreciate, and criticize all at once.
Have you ever been to Berlin?
I lived in Berlin for a summer trying to learn some German.
Oh, okay. Wow. As Oscar Wilde said, life is too short to learn German. So I understand.
Well, I didn't do very well, but I got to where I could read the newspaper, and I passed a translation exam. I had to, as a historian, you have to know some German. So I lived right on the border between Kreuzberg and Neukölln on the canal.
Ooh, nice.
The
cool hipster
place.
Location. Yeah. Everybody wants to live there. But so you've probably seen the Soviet memorial there in Treptow Park. That's another example of this communist baroque kind of. I just think it looks absolutely badass. This giant park, and then on top of it, this huge statue of a Russian soldier with a sword standing on a broken swastika with a German child that he saved from the melee of the combat.
Yeah. I like them. And Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, has that tradition of the spomeniks, which are now, they become kind of very cool, and people really like look for them. But the Tito era abstract sculptural monuments that look kind of like spaceships.
Yeah, those are amazing. Yeah. The Jasenovats, for example.
Yeah, and that's the flower, and then they're all over the former, and they started to be like dismantled, destroyed, forgotten, and now there's a movement to try and get them back. And there's a great photo book about them. If any listener is like, it's Spomenik, Spomenik, and there's a great photo book, and they kind of look like these alien geometrical objects that crash landed in the Balkans. But they're commemorated, mostly World War II monuments, but done in this abstract figurative style of starbursts and strange kind of flower shapes and modern art, but Titoist politics, very, very interesting, very cool. And I hope that they, stop being torn down. Some places they're treated with a lot of respect. Some places they've been allowed to really just fall apart. And some were destroyed in the wars in the 90s.
How is it in the United States being associated or coming from Eastern Europe? I remember your former first lady, who is Slovenian, Melania, for a long time she pretended that she was Austrian, and she even spelled her surname in a different way. She added an S and a U instead of a Slovenian V. So instead of Knaus, she was Knaus SS. But then I think there was too much spotlight on her when her husband became the president, or was a candidate, and she couldn't pretend to be Austrian anymore. And I didn't know this before, but I had an American friend when I was living in Berlin. She was awesome. Shout out to Linda from Colorado. And we were talking one day, and she said, you're not really white, you're ethnic white in the States. She said, my mom would be kind of scared of you, so it's different. And I never heard that before. It was such an interesting comment, and then I kind of loved it. And then I watched the documentary about it, and about the immigration from Eastern Europe to the United States. And there really was such a thing as an ethnic white, Polish, Czech, whatever. And these people were usually relegated to the worst jobs because there were some racist theories going around that they can handle menial jobs better because they're more resistant to dirt and mud and all sorts of like these kind of stereotypes. Is that image still there? A little bit?
So I would say barely.
I see.
But you know what? There's a little bit of it linked. I'll say it's a historian, maybe this is too finicky, but 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago, that first big wave of Eastern European migrants, they really were treated. And I come from I grew up in a part of Pennsylvania that had a ton of that migration. Actually, a lot of Slovenes, a lot of Slovaks, Slovenes, people who came to work in coal mines, in iron. There's a big coal area. So very difficult menial work that, tons of Slovenes, Slovaks, a little bit Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, and that they were kind of at the bottom of the bottom of the white pecking order. Right. They were ethnic whites, and that there was the difference between WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, very kind of mainline traditional, where white people are, and then a level below that Irish, and then kind of a level below that Eastern European. There's an old term called Bohunk. I don't think anyone's ever heard that, but
No.
that's Bohemian Hungarian.
Wow.
And they would you would get Bohunks, and they would have the worst. They wouldn't know no one would be able to communicate with them, and they'd have to carry like molten steel, the stuff that's really like hazardous because it's Pennsylvania steel country.
Yeah.
But that's 100 years ago,
Right.
and those people are mostly now, like Pittsburgh is full of third, fourth generation Slovaks and Slovenes,
Yeah. Yeah.
who still go to church and have ethnic food, but that sense of difference from like Protestant Anglo Americans is very slight. Because it's been so long. Where there is, newer immigrants, and when I was a kid, that was us. We actually had neighbors who called us the beasts from the east, and we're kind of, I had some schoolyard problems, and eggs were thrown in our car, and there's a little bit of anti-immigrant animus in that, but also hard to pin down exactly, but I think there are associations, especially with the Balkan, kind of vaguely Balkan, that the Balkans are kind of vaguely criminal. The Poland area is people who work in still fresh arrivals from Poland. You have a lot of cleaning ladies from Poland. So people, and actually my mom and aunt worked at times as cleaning ladies or as nannies. My cousin worked as a nanny. So those jobs, and that there's something kind of menial about part of the area and kind of somewhat criminal about the other part of the area. And people who don't, but people will, and movies are bad with that. Like there's a movie series called Taken, and the gangsters are Albanian. And people don't know where, but people will be like, where is Albania? And I'm very affectionate. I really love Albania, and I've written about it and spent a lot of time there. But these are almost floating names for people. For a lot of Americans, they couldn't find it on a map. But somehow that kind of former Yugoslavia zone, Albania, Bulgaria, means something kind of gangsterish, and Poland is sort of, menial labor made, something like that. And then Russia's vaguely, is threatening in a different way.
Yeah.
And then parts of it, honestly, like Lithuania, Latvia, Slovakia, people just have no idea. That's just a question mark. So there are prejudices still floating around, but they're a little bit vague.
Right.
And not very, I don't think there's a lot of discrimination based on that, but there are prejudices.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny that people from the Balkans in Hollywood usually kidnap Liam Neeson's daughters.
Unfortunately. it really should.
But to be honest, I mean, it's similar in Western Europe. Let's not just blame America, because I was, when I was working in Berlin, after 3 years, my German boss would still introduce me as Zaza from Serbia.
Oh no.
I was like, okay, here we go. But it's fine. Or even sometimes even Siberia, which was quite amusing.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's rewind all the way back to the beginning. The big question: where do Slavs come from? And how is it possible that the biggest ethno-linguistic group in Europe just kind of teleports itself onto the stage from seemingly, out of nowhere, and then occupies such a large chunk of land?
That's the $10,000 question.
Yeah,
that's a question with no good answer and 100 bad ones. If you really start reading into it, it's a morass of competing theories and not very little evidence. And I actually think I think that's one of these questions though that I think might be answered in our lifetime. I think there's hope that a lot more will be discovered and is being discovered right now, especially because of work on ancient genetics, where you can pull out, sequence genes of bodies that were buried 1,500, 1,600 years ago. And the more of that work that gets done, and a lot of it there's a big study that just came out by a Basque university, but of Balkan, of medieval, Dark Age Balkan genes that were actually going to be able to figure out a little bit what that movement of Slavs looked like and where it came from. But right now, it's a mess, because honestly, every Slavic country traditionally, especially the northern Slavic countries, claim them, like, will just put themselves put themselves forward as a homeland.
Yeah.
Poland says they come from Poland. Ukraine says they come from Ukraine. Russia will say they come from Russia. And the evidence is so sparse, because they just, in the written record, they just show up all of a sudden, and they show up where people write about them is mostly in Greece and close to the Byzantium.
Yeah.
And they had no idea where they were coming from. So there's a theory that they were all over, but that idea of some kind of more collective unity or collective identity, if it existed, started happening because they were fighting for and against the Byzantines. And so paradoxically, there's a theory that happened kind of in that, along the Danube, where Bulgaria and Romania are now. But that really, it's a lot of speculation. There's also signs now from that genetic work that there was a lot of people moving from north to the south, which has been doubted at the past. But from where and how, I have a few more thoughts about it, but that's the big picture.
But in the book, you do mention a theory that Slavs actually come from Romania, where ironically there is no Slavs now.
So that's the idea, is that when the Byzantium Empire was fortifying itself and starting to really try and defend the Balkans, try and create that new frontier, create a line along the Danube, Justinian refortified it and started hiring lots of mercenaries, and it was having lots of attacks. And so it's on that border, what's now southern Romania, that something like Slavdom coalesced. And that is where the first mentions of Slavs all kind of happened there. There are attacks from Romania, from what's now Romania, that had no concept back then, towards Thessaloniki. And that area is where something proto-Slavic was happening. And it's it's a guy named Florin Curta, who is Romanian, but he's maybe the most cutting edge and a very respected scholar, guy at University of Florida, a very kind of cutting edge book on the origin of the Slavs, but also a very controversial one, and kind of to me, a surprising idea. Because I grew up reading Polish books that were clear that Slavs came from basically Poland, Ukraine, and then moved south. So if you actually read his book, Curta's book, I found it very persuasive, but it doesn't have a smoking gun. There's no single document or letter or artifact that conclusively proves that case. So it's one of these historical mysteries that I find hugely compelling. I will read anything about it, but I don't think at this point it has a definitive answer.
How come Slavs, before the advent of Christianity, have no written records about themselves?
They didn't seem to write. We didn't write. And then the shame of it is that no one, when they became Christian, that we didn't have someone, and I include myself in this, that we didn't have someone writing down the old stories, writing down some of the chronicles, because that's what happened in Scandinavia, in Iceland. They became Christian. They had Latin writing, but they still cared about those
old epics,
pre-Christian stories,
right.
Those Norse stories. And that same thing happened in Ireland and Wales, where the Celts became Christian, but it was still valuable to write down some of the old stories. And we have almost none of that in the Slavic world. You have to rely on archaeology. You have to rely on people who saw the Slavs when they were still pagan, Christians usually, but a few Muslims and Jews, but mostly Christians, who saw Slavic religion being practiced, who saw Slavs in the pre-Christian state, but we don't have any real native testimony. Even Lithuanians who aren't Slavic, but they seem to have believed similar things. They did not write them down, even though they stayed pagan until the 1370s. So you're talking really, The Renaissance has already started. It's the War of the Roses in England. And in Lithuania, you've got pagan dukes, pagan rulers, a whole pagan organization, probably similar to what the pagan Slavs were like. It's hard to tell exactly how different. And they didn't write, to have written down at least a myth or a song clearly. But we have to rely on everything, post conversion.
Eventually, we do get these proto-states or kingdoms in Eastern Europe. In the book, you talk about the fact that unlike in other kingdoms at the time, whose royal dynasties usually had some sort of a fantastical, grand story of how they ascended the throne, in the Slavic kingdoms, these narratives were much more modest, sometimes almost cute. Usually they talked about a lucky peasant or a farmer who happened to become a king. In reality, though, a lot of these dynasties established themselves with the help of a little industry called slavery. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think this is the dirty secret of medieval Slavdom. It's really not something I
never heard about that before.
Yeah, and growing up, when I went to Polish school, this is not the story you
exactly.
get told.
Yep.
You get told the traditional story, and the story that's passed down from the Middle Ages is these, even as pagans, that these peasants, different hardworking peasants or wheelwrights or craftsmen in Poland or Czechoslovakia, and actually I think Slovenia has kind of a similar story with the Dukes of Carinthia and what they were supposed to.
Carantania.
Yeah. That it's, and I think that was all covered because the archaeology and the outside chronicles make it pretty clear what was happening on the edge of the Christian space. This is the 900s. There was a gold rush in kind of that Slavic barbarian non-Christian world. And the gold rush was the slave trade. You could not enslave Christians. You could enslave pagans. And you could sell, there was an enormous appetite for slaves, especially for Slavic slaves in the Middle East, in Iran, Iraq. And they had an enormous amount of silver. They had big silver mines. There was a big appetite for this. There was also an appetite for it in Venice and Spain. So the kingdoms that started, looks like they got their start by hiring lots of mercenaries, hiring their own soldiers, protecting an area, and then raiding outside of it, grabbing people, and then sending them by caravan to other places. And that seems that in Slovenia too, Samo's kingdom,
right?
That kind of not clear. That seems to have been a Frankish slave trader who started on the edge of that Carolingian world. You could go past, it's kind of like the Wild West in reverse, the Wild East, that you can get beyond the Christian frontier and out in these tribes. You could start, if you could have enough armed followers, you could start raiding, then you could start selling. And those captives were the biggest industry in Europe. Because each slave was worth an amount of silver. There was a little bit of other trading, fur, beeswax, forest things, but it was slavery that was the economic driver. And ultimately, with an economic push like that and a lot of silver flowing in, you could start building a state. You could go from being a tribe to having fortifications, roads, an army, a duke, a king. But that's not a story people wanted to tell later because it's not an attractive reality.
So usually you had a warlord who had some warriors, and like you said, they had a little fort, and then they were expanding, all with the help of raids and acquiring slaves that then they were selling all throughout Europe. Wow, that's really fascinating, especially because a lot of right-wing narrative, at least in Slovenia, probably it's similar in other Eastern European countries, revolves around the fact that these were some sort of proto-democratic kingdoms where milk and honey was flowing and equality reigned supreme. So it's really, really amusing that the truth, at least based on archaeological evidence, is quite the opposite.
it's a little jarring, yeah, because
It is.
they were 100 years into having these kingdoms, and they gave up. They became Christian, and they kind of gave up the slave trade. They wrote the chronicles tell these stories. They're very kind of convincing. You're like, oh, they chose someone from the people, and they ruled with consent,
Right. Yeah,
and they listened to each other. And it's like, well, where did and then you dig in and you find these big jars of silver from the Middle East, and you find massacres and chains, and you're like, this doesn't quite line up. So that's a story that does not get told in schools, but I think is increasingly like clear that seems to be the truth behind what was happening.
By the way, why were Slavic slaves so popular in the Middle East and other places?
That's interesting. A little bit of this is a millennia ago, but the idea, at least in the Middle East, what we have surviving, is that they needed a lot of slaves because they were actually Iraq, a very different world back then, where Iraq was very irrigated, very cultivated, kind of the economic center of the world, huge need for manpower, but kind of labor and soldiers. And they used slaves for a lot of that. And the soldiers, they like to have people from Central Asia. They like to have Turks. Turks made really good soldiers. They were good at riding. They were good at archery. And Slavs were seen as very good for domestic work, for working in the palace, for working with women, for being refined. And the idea was that and also a lot of eunuchs on both sides, eunuchs being made. And it became a trend. And I think those are the two big sources of slaves. That Viking, Russia, Rus comes out of this too, is that they were raiding in northern Russia, sending people down the Dnieper, sending them to Baghdad, sending them to Baku, places like that. And the Saqualiba. We don't have any we have people writing from the other side. Describing slaves. We don't have any slaves writing about themselves or writing about their own experiences. I mean, actually, there was a Slavic slave revolt in Morocco at one point.
Really?
And and I didn't have this space in this book. Slavic slaves who worked in the Muslim part of Spain and Morocco, they were actually one country, revolted, and for a while they had their own little rebel kingdom somewhere in northern Morocco, and they left no records. It's again this problem of really Slavic history, very little writing. But there was Slavic slavery, there's also Slavic slave revolt. But all of that is so shadowy and so hard to pin down. But that Abbasid world, that world of 10th century Baghdad, also had lots of East African slaves. They also had their own revolt in Bahrain. So you had a really, really different world of multiple kinds of slavery, in which Slavs featured as one of those.
Interesting, because I had a historian of the Ottoman Empire on the podcast, and he was also talking about the devshirme system and about slaves coming from the Balkans into the Ottoman Empire later. And they were reputed for being good soldiers, the janissaries and administrators. So it kind of changes, I see, from period to period.
It kind of swings. Because, the Serbs were...
Right.
The Turks looked at the Serbs as great soldiers.
Yeah.
And the Greeks as great sailors, and kind of had a different way of evaluating those groups.
Anyway, one of the main threads of the book that I found fascinating is the fact that historically Eastern Europe was always a place of great diversity, where people of different religions, speaking different languages, doing different things, lived side by side, and they did so for centuries. Much more so than Western Europe, at least at the time. And that's another blind spot we usually have about Eastern Europe, especially since, well, except maybe Russia, most Eastern European countries today are pretty homogeneous places when we compare them to the West. Anyway, how come medieval European rulers kind of welcomed immigration with such open arms at the time?
Yeah, it's a great question, because the pattern, kind of big picture-wise, is that Western Europe used to be diverse in similar ways, just like we were talking about Muslim Spain. Spain had that, or Iberia had that combination of Jews and Muslims and Christians and Al-Andalus and the kind of melting pot of different cultures. Southern France had that too. Italy, Sicily used to be a Muslim area. There used to be a lot more Jews in France and England and in Germany. But as those countries kind of became more established, rigid kingdoms, like it's more going from kind of mixtures of the different distributed power of dukes and local rulers to full established states, they became more and more homogenous. So that the end of that process is that moment in 1492 in Spain, when Spain conquers the last Muslim kingdom and simultaneously expels its Jews. And that last trace of that kind of diverse Western European world gets kicked out. And where did the Jews go? Mostly go to Morocco and the Ottoman Empire and the Balkans. And the Muslims also go to North Africa and sometimes the Ottoman Empire. And meanwhile, the Eastern European powers have a great need for manpower, have a great need for development, have need for people who can connect them to a wider world commercially and a wider world religiously and have some fighting skills. So they are inviting foreigners in a big way, in a consistent way, and making room for them. So Poland, Lithuania, some vast kingdom at some point, becomes the real homeland of Europe's Jews, and Eastern Europe becomes this cradle, really, of world or Ashkenazi Jewry. You have Muslim tribes coming in or nomads and being also recruited by Hungary and by Lithuania to be mercenaries. And then you have that Ottoman push that brings the actual Ottoman Muslim rulers. And you also have other nomads coming in from Anatolia and from the steppes. And so it becomes a melting pot, partly from conquest, partly through deliberate strategy of needing Western Europeans, asking like Germans to come, to be miners, to work in and develop towns. Economic development in Eastern Europe happened by inviting people from outside, from East and West, by having traders come in, Armenians, Greeks, or Germans, or Scots from all over. There was a big Scottish immigration at one point, and there were a lot of Polish Scots, so different groups get established and it became very diverse that way. So to the point that in the Eastern European pattern was that countryside would have one language, the peasantry would have one language, and cities or any towns would be completely different from the surrounding countryside, and usually with different groups in that, and the landlords would be something else.
Yeah.
So you have this very segmented, very kind of layer cake of a society in which each layer has a different language and religion and ethnicity, but they're all living very close to each other. They're all related kind of by occupation.
Could you talk about this dynamic of day-to-day life at that time, of all these like very different communities at the time? Like you said, I think in the book you say they're like layers of cake, right? How did these people manage to coexist, and what did that look like?
Well, people lived very close together, and this pattern really lasted up to deep into the 19th century, some places the 20th century. And the specifics of it were different based on place to place.
Right.
But the broad pattern, and I think this is true from Slovenia to Estonia down to Romania, in most places, and very different from Western Europe, very different from like Central Russia too, in which in Russia you have different castes. Essentially you have serfs and you have merchants and you have nobles, but they're all Russian. They're all Russian Orthodox, they're all Russian speaking. In a place like what's now Ukraine, or it's Poland, say Eastern Poland, Western Ukraine, the peasants would be Ukrainian. The landowner would be Polish. So the peasants would be Ukrainian, Eastern Orthodox, the landowner is Polish Catholic, and all the merchants in town are going to be Jewish and Yiddish speaking. So you have three languages. And in the town, in a village of like 200 people, you'll have all three of those. You'll have a little Catholic church for the landowner. You'll have a bigger Orthodox church for the peasants. You'll have the Jewish enclave buying and selling things. And each kept separate by law and by custom. You can't really cross between those because if you switch, you're not really allowed to. Intermarriage is difficult. Switching professions or switching kind of caste level is prohibited. So people are kept very narrowly uh, in their stratum of society, and they interact and they're interdependent, but they also don't know that much about each other. Slovenia might be simpler, but it had that, the Czechia, Croatia, Slovenia, of often German-speaking landowners, Slavic-speaking peasants, and then towns that are something in between, and often German predominates. In Romania, you have German-speaking towns, Hungarian, in Transylvania, Hungarian landowners, and Romanian peasants. And so that pattern, each part of that 3 or 4 layer cake, the flavors change, but that structure is the same. And it's very different than German. You never find that in what's a German town in Neckar or Frankfurt. You have different professions, but everyone's German. Everyone's usually by law one kind of Protestant or one kind of Catholic, and everyone has to be that same thing. In Eastern Europe, it's never the case. You almost always have at least 2, 3, or 4 of these different linguistic social layers.
All right. So like you said, these communities did live side by side, but it wasn't some sort of utopia. It wasn't exactly Disneyland, though. Despite living side by side, religious and ethnic borders weren't easy to cross, especially between landlords and serfs or peasants, right? That's also why... Yeah, in Slovenia, for example, where the landlords, like you said, were always German or Italian, we have this proud history of unsuccessful peasant rebellions that were always brutally repressed.
Yeah, and it's easy to idealize. It's a world that is genuinely pre-modern, and it lasts for a long time.
Yeah,
and has this ability. You have incredible social diversity in very tight spaces. A town of 1,500 people could have 4 religions, and I can point to you look at the maps, like a little town, but 4 different neighborhoods. Each speaks a different language. Each goes to a different church, and they coexist. But that doesn't mean people like each other, and they don't exactly, and they're kept separate. And it's a world that runs on inequality, where inequality is woven into everything. And empire, because it's a world of empires. These empires run on inequality. Having these groups at odds with each other actually strengthens the empire, because you play different groups against each other. You have landowners who are dependent on the center because they can't depend. They have nothing in common with the people who are their tenants, who are their serfs. You have merchants who owe everything to the lord of the area because they are separate religiously from all the people around them. So there's all this suspicion and hostility, and yet you also have a kind of real diversity that really vanishes with this. Real diversity may be wrong, but the modern state that is predicated on equality, you have to start getting rid of that. When France becomes a modern country, gets rid of its king, gets rid of the French Revolution, has this model of a new nation state, you try and teach everyone one language, try and have everyone be serve some time in the army, everyone go to the same kind of elementary school, and turn people into little, clones of each other. And you try and get rid of that diversity and have a homogeneous country. In Eastern Europe, that mostly happens through violence, through genocide, ethnic cleansing, and also movement of borders, movement of popular flight, movement of research, and some assimilation. And all those together, very violently, very late for the European story, starting late 19th century, but really accelerating in the 20th century, and really happening in the biggest way in World War II and after. That really kind of destroys this world.
So although it was kind of hard and undesirable, interactions between communities do happen. You describe this wonderfully in the book, how, I'm probably not going to get it right, but how sometimes Catholics would go to a Muslim healer and then or a rabbi, or borrow each other's saints, stuff like this. That's really kind of endearing. Could you talk about a little bit more about these inter-community interactions? How did they play out, and when did they? And how come this was sometimes tolerated? How come this was sometimes fine?
So at the official level, religions were kept, and usually all these separations are all overlapping religious, linguistic, ethnic. All those things are different at once. And at the official level, there's not supposed to be much mixing. At the official level, definitely Catholics and Jews aren't allowed to, on both sides. You cannot transgress that boundary at all. Orthodox Muslim and Orthodox Christian also officially, according to the church elders, according to the Muslim elders, no mix. At the folk level, where people are living next to each other, living literally side by side, door to door,
Right.
Village to village, tremendous amount of contact, and especially at the level of kind of folk healing, folk remedy, folk magic. You know, in a world without medicine, with very little, very low literacy and very low, university training. This is a world where folklore is the everyday currency of life. You have all this like living contact. And if you, get down to that level and read about what people were doing, and historically it's often hard, history is usually written at this like high level of the officials.
Yeah.
But you can't, not the low level of regular village life, but there is stuff from that. And you discover Christians would go to major rabbis to get blessings, and different things would be valuable. People really believe that rabbis could cure infertility, regardless of religion. So Catholic women would go to Jewish rabbis for that. Jews believe that Muslims, at least in Lithuania, were really good at treating madness, treating mental disorders. So they would go and send, if they had a relative with a mental disability, they would send them to live with Tartars, to live with Muslims, because that was thought somehow that change would help. In Albania and in the Balkans, you would have shared Christmases. Muslims coming over to their Christian neighbors for Christmas, Christians going to their Muslims neighbors for Bayram, clans that would split and maintain. In Albania, you would have clans that would have a Christian branch and a Muslim branch, but all related, and they would exchange ceremonies, exchange saints, and holiness would kind of circulate that way. And so there wasn't, at the official level, even at the legal level, big hard walls. At the local level, lots of kind of change, bartering and exchanging and circulating and seeing pragmatic value in each other's essentially magic. Jews could be lucky, they could be unlucky. Muslims could be, could regard Christian ceremonies as part of their own and actually part of their, so this very fluid world that you have to kind of get back to.
That made me think of the last chapters of the book when you described some huge, I don't know if it's annual or if it's always open Polish market in Warsaw, where you could get anything. But then people would a lot of the times have a picture of a Jew in their home that they would get from there. And that the reasoning was that he would invite money into your house. But then for the Sabbath, you have to put the picture down because he needs his day of rest. And you have to turn him away from the door, right? So the money doesn't leave your domicile.
And it's I'm a Polish Jew. I'm from a mixed Polish Jewish family. So this is kind of really strange to be exoticized now, because this is not the 19th century. This is
this is after the Second World War, right?
Well, no, this is after the 1993. So this is bizarre. I would go to.
Right. Right.
It got so it doesn't exist anymore. It got bulldozed because of the Euros. When the soccer tournament was in Poland, they leveled this incredible, gigantic bazaar, maybe the biggest in Eastern Europe, and put a giant soccer stadium on it. So it's if anyone knows Warsaw, it's in Prague, it's on the other side of the river. So before 2010, it was this enormous bazaar that especially in the early 90s, was the clearinghouse of all of Eastern Europe for kind of cheap. In Polish we say tandeta. I don't know if there's a Slovene version of it, but kind of cheap socks, crappy lingerie, anything cheap and affordable and mass produced and brought in by truck or by train from China or Korea or Russia or wherever.
No, we had
Just
those in
these-
the Balkans,
yeah.
only not on that scale.
So this was kind of the bazaar of bazaars, where all their bazaars would get their stuff. So the scale was enormous. And I talked to anthropologists who worked there, because you could find people from all over Eastern Europe, but also thousands of Poles. And there was this belief, this folk belief, essentially surviving, of the lucky Jew, the Jew with the coin. And for people outside, it was just like, oh, this is just a stereotype. And it's like, yes, but it's also a kind of magical presence. It's almost like a fossil of another era of you actually, people believed in it and used it just the way you described, of like you position it, and you sometimes would have an actual statue, sometimes you have a photocopy of a thing, and to try and keep people's luck going. Because this is a hard scrabble place. This is people, sometimes selling, two rusty nails, mismatched socks, and a pot, and hoping to make money. But that is that little bit of that pre-modern magical world surviving.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Although now it's a soccer stadium.
Yeah.
It's harder.
All right, if we go back a little bit, for a time, I believe, especially during the Enlightenment, the biggest capitals of Eastern Europe, such as Prague, became kind of delicious, almost rogues galleries, safe havens for some of the most memorable characters that existed at the time, obscure prophets, scammy alchemists, practitioners of the occult, also lots of legitimately smart people. How did this sassy world in Eastern Europe come about?
It's one of the many benefits of being political weakness, of having, when you don't have the strength to impose unity, you get a lot of diversity growing in the cracks. That pattern, both in Western Europe and in Russia, of having a strong state, a Kremlin or a Rome or that France of Louis XIV that can have bureaucrats go everywhere and turn them to make things very uniform, drives that diversity. Literally, like Louis XIV, or some Protestants left in France, drives them out. The Russian czars, as they're organizing, they recruit Muslims for a while, and then they try and convert them, they try and push them out. There's a drive to impose homogeneity. Eastern Europe / Central Europe, politically much more confused. Even when there are empires, like the Habsburg Empire, actually when we say empires in the sense of, yes, there was a lot of different pieces and they were big. But empire in terms of having a single kind of uniform power structure and everything depending on the center, usually not. Usually it's like pieces, in Slovenia, it's that dukedom of Carinthia, the dukes had their own agenda, and Bohemia had its own electoral king and its own laws, and everything is Habsburg. But for a long time, the Habsburgs had limited ways of imposing themselves. So you have all this stuff growing, and Poland-Lithuania was a mess. There was very little central authority. Romania was a mess. A lot of these countries were assembled out of pieces, and that central power was very weak. And in that allowed for all this growth. And actually some people recruited diversity, and some people they couldn't do anything about it. So there was no Inquisition in Poland. There was none of that drive to impose Catholic unity. There was just a lot of space. The Ottomans didn't have great control over the Balkans for a lot of it, so you could have sects running away from Anatolia and people finding places like Bulgaria or Bosnia to do their own things that were different. And there wasn't a lot anyone could do about it. The benign neglect, in a way.
Right. Writing and researching this book, who became your favorite out of these, what should we call it, outlaw characters? Or maybe not outlaw characters, but, these sassy, there's a lot of Roma kings and sort of like prophets that are just crossing one religion to another, alchemists, scammers. There's a lot of absolutely colorful, fantastic stories in the book. But you must have one that's also a lot of the times very amusing. But you must have some that really blew you away.
I have a lot. I'll tell you one. As you mentioned the Roma, there's one I had never heard of, and I think very few people have heard of it. So, Roma woman named Gina Ranicic.
The poet. The poetess.
Who's a poetess.
Yeah.
You could say Croat, although she's hard to pin down. But her name, she ends up living and dying in Croatia, that part of Croatia that's inland, that's next to Serbia. But she had this incredibly adventurous life. She belonged to a Roma band, a roaming nomadic band that moved around what's now Croatia, Serbia, probably Austria. In the early 19th century, probably she's born around 1830, and she has this incredibly adventurous life of living in Constantinople and Adrianople and having husbands who are bandits, who are traitors, who are Ottoman dignitaries, and then she's abandoned by them. Her story is so kind of wild and operatic, I can only tell a little bit of it. And then at the end of her life, she's an old woman, very poor, very abandoned, and she meets an ethnographer, someone who's like gathering Roma stories, gathering Roma folk poetry, Roma folk traditions, and he hears that there's this poet somewhere out in this little camp, a tabor, which is a migrant camp, and starts talking to her around the 1890s, and she's a very old woman, and she just unspools this incredibly complicated story that has these just, husbands who try to murder her, husbands she tries to murder, she vanishes, she has to run away, love affairs, crazy movements through every European country. And she's also a really good poet, probably the first recorded Roma poet. She tells this man, this kind of German, Romanian, Polish man, her songs, and I found her, in a book full of kind of stories like that. She stood out, and because that's a novel waiting to be written. Someone to tap into that. And I could only kind of tell her story till like age 23, and it keeps going. It keeps just being wilder and crazier and shipwrecks. And actually she's a good poet, and she's just forgotten by history. And it's one of these stories because who does she belong to? The Eastern Europe story of like, is she Croatian? Maybe, but Croats don't claim her. Is she Ottoman because she lived in Constantinople for a long time? Maybe, but they don't claim her. And Roma, there's no Roma state, there's no Roma archive, there's no Roma studies. So that doesn't, have like that slot for her. She just belongs to the whole region as a whole, I think. So she's an example of one of people I really like. It was a real discovery, someone I'd never heard of. And I think it's still barely known.
Well, I've never heard of Jakob Frank before.
He
was probably my favorite story in the book. Could you tell us a little bit about him?
I'll tell you, I grew up hearing about Jakob Frank because he's not well known globally, but he's kind of well known in Poland.
What a character!
Incredible
Amazing.
Character. And Olga Tokarczuk, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, the Polish novelist, she wrote this giant book, hard to get through, but called The Book of Jacob.
Okay.
Great title, according to me. I love it. But it's a novel about his life, very close to his story. And he was a Polish Jew, a little bit of asterisk there, because you could also say he's a Bosnian Jew. A Jew in the 18th century who traveled a lot to the Balkans, traveled a lot towards Constantinople, and became fascinated by this Jewish Messiah who declared himself the Messiah in the 17th century. Aroused enormous excitement, enormous interest across the Jewish world. People were like, "Oh, it's finally happened." We have we've been waiting 1500, however, almost 2000 years.
Yeah,
it's happened. We have our Messiah. It happened, and then the Ottoman authorities are like, "Well,
wait a minute.
Here's a choice.
Right.
You can continue being the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah." And we'll shoot arrows at you until you're dead. We'll execute you by arrow. Or you can convert to Islam and save your life. And he's like, I'll take Islam. I'm Muslim now.
Smart man.
Yeah. And then his followers are like, well, this is troubling because our Messiah is now Muslim. And so they find an explanation. They're like, well, this must be part of the plan. And so part of them keep following him, keep following his descendants, and they kind of become Muslim Jews or crypto Jews, and other Jews reject them, and they become this thing in between. And this Polish Jew discovers this. He's like, this is amazing. Maybe I could become a person like this. And he's married, so he gets in with these messianic crypto Jews and brings that idea back to Poland and finds and creates like a cult around himself. And part of what the appeal of this belief system is that if you have the Messiah on your side, everything is allowed. All those complicated Jewish laws, all that Talmud, all that Torah, if you have the Messiah telling you what you can do, he can tell you, sin, because the more you sin, the more you can find redemption. So everything
makes sense to me. I don't know.
So like sin more, then you get more redemption. So all the sexual laws, all the dietary laws, all that baggage of Judaism gets lifted. And so they're able to kind of party and have orgies and do whatever they want. And then he has a whole story. I won't bore your listeners with the complicated story of how he becomes Catholic and then he stops being Catholic and bounces between empires. But a wonderful story too. Not a discovery. So that story, at least though, I actually knew about for a long time, unlike the other one, which was totally obscure to me. But also there's if you want to read 1,000 pages about that, that novel will take you through his life page by page. It's pretty thrilling.
I mean, say what you will about his religion, but I see a lot of sense of it, you know? You have to sin in order to find grace. I mean, what's not logical about that?
And if you get forgiven for sinning, the more you sin, the more you can be forgiven. There is a logic.
Didn't Rasputin later on practice something similar?
Some of that same kind of idea, right. That you lower yourself to be brought up high. And if you want to be religious, but you also want to
party a little bit,
explore some things, it's an attractive way.
People find some sense in this logic across the centuries and across religions, so there must be something to it. All right. Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of time to cover the decidedly tragic 20th century Eastern Europe. However, I do want us to talk about something important that is often overlooked in the story of Eastern Europe, but which you do mention in the book, and that is our Black sense of humor. You write the following: but amidst all our differences, Eastern Europeans share one legacy in common, and that is a gift for seeing comedy amidst tragedy. Is that simply a coping mechanism?
I would just say a coping mechanism, and not simply. I think it's actually hard to cope with things that are truly difficult. And there is more violent history, there's a sense of Eastern Europe, there are bad things that happen everywhere. But Eastern Europe, I think, is specific in having, for a lot of its history, no sense of stability or security. None of that kind of like hard ground that you're like, France isn't going to disappear. Russia's not going to disappear. But a lot of these, Poland disappeared. Hungary disappeared. Slovenia took a very hard way of being born. Yugoslavia disappeared. That the whole foundation of life, and before that, Austro-Hungary disappeared, that your whole world can vanish within your lifetime, multiple times, that you have to find yourself on this kind of sweeping sea and find a place in it. And humor is a way of reestablishing these coordinates. And I think so I would say a coping mechanism, but not just a coping mechanism. It's hard to cope with things that are this hard.
Yeah. Well, the internet is making sure that this kind of unique brand of humor isn't going anywhere, because Slavic memes are experiencing an absolute renaissance online, and they're a big hit there. In an ironic twist of fate, I feel like some form of a digital form of kind of almost pan-Slavism or of brotherhood over similar destinies is emerging because of the memes now.
The Gopnik and there's a little bit of
the Slavic squat and all of this stuff. And
the tracksuit.
That
unifies us.
And how you open your grandma's jar of cookies that looks very nice from the outside, but inside there's always just like needles and stuff for sewing. Bottles of water that are actually bottles of vodka, and you find that out the hard way and stuff like this.
Absolutely.
Anyway, let's talk about the many predicaments of Eastern European countries today? Obviously, we have the senseless war in Ukraine, but even without it, you believe Eastern Europe is in a bit of a pickle. I think you write the following in the book. Here we go. I think this is the last chapter. Many Eastern European nations face an odd predicament. They possess a surplus of history, but a deficit of useful narrative. That is, plenty of things have happened to them, but not enough has been done by them to establish a deeply rooted sense of shared destiny. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think we were talking at the start of the podcast about history and politics, and finding and having almost to often invent a usable past. That's a process every country goes through, and a process that many countries have to revise. In America, we keep relitigating the Civil War, keep relitigating kind of traumas of the past. But in Eastern Europe, a lot of countries have to, almost the whole bloc really, since in our lifetimes, has had to find new coordinates of what it means to be Latvian, Lithuanian, Polish, Slovenian, Ukrainian, etc. What does it mean to, what's the kind of essential, important ethos of that country? And because politically you have to either stand up for it or contest it. So you have this very, kind of difficult birthing process of figuring out what each of these countries mean, not just what it is, but what it means. And you have things going in very different directions. Hungary has had a very strange kind of evolution of that, where they've gone back to their nomadic past, or their imagined nomadic past, and they really celebrate
Mongolian
this
kind of
pagan
setting.
or Mongolian myth. And yet, if you go, Budapest does not feel like a Mongolian city. It feels like
not at all. No, I've been there.
Not at all.
Yeah.
But then you'll go to a mall and there'll be huge boulders with runes or with step design, they've really, and the government has really poured money into the celebration of a step background. Poland is looking for its kernel, and the previous government, the peace government, it was all about World War II and a very specific vision of World War II, a very kind of anti-communist, specific kind of group of people that they were celebrating and honoring and elevating above. And in North Macedonia, I don't know if you've been to
Alexander
Skopje, it's
the Great.
The strangest.
Yes.
Yeah, Alexander the Great. And then they've had to
Skopje.
walk it back. So he's still there, but he's kind of not Macedonian. But it's a lot of this thing. And so you have, in some ways, the more politics achieves, and in some places, the more you kind of take care of some of the basics of life, of EU membership, or this is kind of pre-2020, pre-Ukraine. But the more of that, the kind of bread and potatoes, meat and potatoes stuff gets done, the more politics you get into wrangling over what's the proper historical destiny, what's the proper image of the past that you should put forward, and contesting that and trying to use that as a wedge to, mobilize voters on one side or the other. So you have a lot of right-left discourse around that. And you're still, nation building is very, very new. You have countries that are, Slovakia is historically brand new. Slovenia is brand new. The Baltics have had that very short period of existence between the two world wars, and now they're starting anew. And people are in some ways it can be positive. I think there are new forms of government. You can see all kinds of innovation in Estonia around government and how government can be run, but it can also be really negative. You just have this constant relitigation of the past to inflame people and to drive wedges and to mobilize voting blocs. But then in Ukraine, you look at that, it is such a divided memory in that country, and such a divided past and divided geographically. And if the book had come out, and the book was going to come out a year earlier, the story of Ukraine would have been of another one of these kind of, two different histories or two or more histories and presence in contestation. And now I think it's an incredibly unified country fighting an external enemy. So when there's a bigger problem, these smaller these kind of less existential problems of identity and history can vanish very quickly.
And it's also interesting how personally your identity it can switch or is prone to adapt. I was always like Slovenian when I was in Slovenia, but then when I moved to Germany, nobody knew where or what Slovenia is. So I started embracing a more of a Eastern European kind of identity, hanging out with other folks from Eastern Europe or the Balkans and understanding the appeal in it, which I wouldn't have if I stayed in Slovenia, for example. I don't know.
I think and I think that idea of Eastern Europe in a way, I grew up a little bit in Poland and a lot more outside of Poland. And Eastern Europe is more of a thing that exists when you're outside of it, that you get grouped with other people and then people group you with this block. And when you're grouped with them, you actually do discover there are things in common.
Exactly.
There is things you don't perceive within Poland. It's such like a Pole and a Slovak is so different. And it's a totally different kind of Poles and Czechs almost think of themselves as opposites in their views on everything, especially religion and sex and just the two different societies. But you take Poles and Czechs and put them in England, it's kind of the same thing. Yeah. And you discover, well, in a lot of ways, like we have these we see, this tunnel vision in country, but there's also like a bigger commonality. Because a lot of the history in outline, in types of experience is shared. I mean, those same like kind of beats in families, you get the same, big pivotal years, the big pivotal events, slightly different, shading on each of them. But it's a similar, the history. And I was surprised even going to places that seem very remote from Poland, like Albania, Bulgaria. Actually some real similarities, just even at the level of like
architecture
and like people's kind of attitude towards things from the West and attitude towards family and travel. Very, very like kind of domestic, intimate things. Very similar and quite different from something you'd find in Germany.
Maybe we should institute like a mandated temporary exile for all Eastern Europeans for a little bit, and then when they come back, they're like, "Hey, we can get along."
It'd be good to like rotate a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's
rotate. Yeah, that would be nice.
Yeah, kind of discover, because you have to be out. I do think you discover those commonalities once you're outside of your home country.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I haven't thought about it before, but it makes perfect sense. Jakub, thank you so much. Your book is so good. I really recommend it to everybody. Probably available everywhere, right?
There's a UK version, there's an American version, there's a German language version, and there's some more on the way. But anywhere English language books are sold.
Okay. Any Eastern European translations coming up?
There's some coming. Awesome. We're gonna have Hungarian, Czech, and some more on the way.
Awesome.
But
yeah, absolutely fantastic. I enjoyed every second of it. Do you have any social media? Where can people follow your work?
They're not that active, but it's J Mikanowski or Jacob Mikanowski on Instagram. J Mikanowski on Twitter is easiest, and then I have a website, Jacob Mikanowski, which has the Instagram link, Twitter link. Those are the main ones.
What are you working on right now? Do you have any other books coming up? Or
I do, but it's a little bit. It's in the early stages, and I have to keep it kind of.
Yeah,
I don't. Yeah, not yet.
Okay. Well, looking forward to it, and I hope we can do this again. Again, Absolutely. Thank you so much. This was
thank you so much. It was a joy talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the episode. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe and follow on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. As always, eternal glory and gratitude to my producers who are supporting this show on Patreon, the kings and queens, Gordan, Jurechuk, Lorenzo, Veronica, Mila, Carmen, and Taichi. Without you, this pod would not have been possible at all. If you'd like to become a certified Tovarish or Tovarishica of the show too, head to Patreon, find Smart Cookies podcast on there, and become one. It's as simple as that. Thank you.